Hey there, and welcome to the Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast. In today's success interview, it was my privilege to interview Professor Michael Meyer.
My passion and my mission to help you unleash your greatness within. My heart goes out to the underdogs that's on their way. If you think you can go from good to great, okay, let's motivate. GreatnessWithin.com. TJ Hoisington. GreatnessWithin.com.
You see, Michael Meyer has written this new book, Benjamin Franklin's Last Bet, and you're going to discover it in this interview. It's so rich and so full of nuggets of wisdom, and I think you're going to find that throughout this interview. But let me just give you a little bit of background, and I'll let him do some of this himself when he jumps into the interview here. But Michael Meyer was among the first Peace Corps volunteers to enter China, or sent to China, the setting of his 3 award-winning books and eventual, if unlikely, conduit to Benjamin Franklin, which he'll describe here in just a second. He's a Guggenheim Fellow and a winner of many awards. He is a professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches nonfiction writing and lives in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. He is currently a Fulbright scholar in Taiwan, which is another connection with me because I lived there several years ago, and we have a quick chat about that. So if you're watching this, wherever you're watching this, hey, do me a favor. Would you mind liking this video? Would you mind sharing this video? I'd really appreciate it. If you're listening to it because you downloaded it from my podcast on iTunes or iHeartRadio or Spotify, hey, do me a favor, like that as well. At least at a minimum, become a part of my community. My goal is to help you and people like you unleash your greatness within. And that's why I do these interviews. So without any further ado, let's jump right into this interview with Michael Meyer. Michael, welcome to the Unleash Your Greatness Within podcast.
Thanks for having me, TJ. Delighted to be here.
Totally delighted to have you. I think the subject matter, your book coming out, Ben Franklin's Last Bet, which we're going to talk about in depth today. But before we get into that, one of the things I like to do with all my audience, all my guests and so forth, is get a little bit of your backstory. Could you share with us some of your history, please?
Well, it kind of ties into where this book came from, which is I came upon this book by accident, really. And it came via China, of all places. I grew up in Minnesota. I worked as a journalist and a public school teacher, as a reading teacher for many years, and then joined the Peace Corps, thinking Peace Corps was going to send me to Latin America because I was a Spanish speaker. And instead they called and said China. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. And they said, you leave in 3 weeks. Oh, wow. And that was 1995. So, it's still in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square and before the big economic miracle of China. And I ended up in a rural village, in Southwest Sichuan province, no Chinese, didn't know how to use chopsticks, first foreigner people had seen. I ended up staying in China for almost 15 years, writing 3 books about life and its overlooked corners. And then I came back to the States, and the State Department was hosting a lunch for then President Hu Jintao. And the State Department asked if I would come to the lunch. And I felt really unqualified for this. I'm the son of construction workers, and I've written books about China, but who am I? And they said, oh, we always like to have a writer because it makes us look classy. You can't have 2 writers because then they would just sit and complain to each other the whole time. They'd grumble in the back. Yeah. But anyways, I ended up going to this lunch at the State Department, and Barbra Streisand was there, and Colin Powell was there, and Yo-Yo Ma was playing his cello. And I walked into a side room. I felt really uncomfortable, and I put my hand on a table, and a voice said, don't touch that. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. And he said, that's the table where Benjamin Franklin had signed the Treaty of Paris. And this was a Marine Guard talking to me. And I thought immediately, oh no, I don't know what the Treaty of Paris is. And so this Marine and I started talking. And it got me, it made me feel very stupid later on, realizing I know more about Chinese history than I know about the founding of my own country. I don't know anything really about Benjamin Franklin. And so to tie this back into who I am and my background, at my heart, I'm a teacher. At my heart, I'm always trying to teach to that kid in the back of the room who's looking out the window, because that's who I was in a classroom. And so I wanted to, connect Franklin to today's readers in a non-academic way, because when I went back to my hotel room that night and started Googling Franklin, I read his last will and testament, and I couldn't believe, A, how amazing his will was,
Totally.
and B, that no one had written about it. And so to put a button on this, I'll just say that I know it's time to write a book when the book I want to read doesn't exist. And I thought, we need to know this story of Franklin, and I'll be the one to tell it.
Wow. And where do you live right now?
I'm in Taipei, Taiwan. I'm writing a biography of the island. So right now I'm teaching.
Oh, you're serious?
Yeah. I think the United States is really good at clamoring for books about foreign places when it's too late. 8 months ago, it was, where's the good book about Afghanistan? Right now, it's, where's the good book about Ukraine?
Yeah.
And unfortunately,
I gotta say, we'll have to have you when that book comes out on the show again. Here's why. 25 years ago, I was a missionary in Taiwan. When I first went there, I couldn't speak Chinese like you, or China for you. I've not been to mainland yet, but I learned to speak Chinese, and that caught my eye as well when your staff reached out to me and so forth. What a small world that brings us together, and the love for those Chinese people and the Taiwanese people over there in Taiwan, just amazing.
Yeah, it's a great place to work. And I have to say the missionary tradition here is really helpful to historians because there's such great archives of letters. And, the missionary, George Mackay, is celebrated here. He's got his own museum display at the end of one of the light rail lines here because of
Does he? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a hospital still with his name on it. And they just celebrated the anniversary of his arrival in Taiwan. The president Tsai Ing-wen was at the ceremony last weekend. So it's helpful to me, actually, the missionary president in the past in Taiwan, because I have these letters and these historical records because of that.
Do you still see, just as a side note, do you still see the two little missionaries riding their bikes around with the white shirts and ties?
Of course. Was that you at one point?
That was me 20 something years ago.
You drew a good assignment, I have to say. Of all the places to be sent, you could have been sent to Las Vegas or something.
You don't get to choose, but you said you were a reading teacher, and my audience knows about me that I didn't read my first book till I was a junior in high school because I didn't believe I could. I was in special resources. I was the person that was looking out the window, dreaming big, but I was a little bit discouraged, and I won't get into my story.
Look at us now, though. I love these connections that we're here.
Absolutely. It's just, I felt there was a connection here. So let's jump right into what you're doing with this great book that I got to tell you, one of the things I really strive to do with all my guests is actually read the book. And you know what? I've gone through it. I have more information here and more questions than we have time for. But my goal is to make it entertaining for the people that are listening to this and try to make it appealing in such a way that can connect the dots on how it affects our world today and what it was like then a little bit. So here were some key words as I was reading your book that I came up with. And you tell me if there's any that I missed, all right? Okay. And I know I'm throwing you on the spot here.
No, go for it.
So Benjamin Franklin was disciplined.
Yep.
Visionary. Progressive. He was a futurist. Philanthropist. He was witty, and you see that in some of his quotes and stuff. He was useful, and he desired, and I think this is huge, to live a useful life.
Yeah.
He was insightful. I mean, some of the things you write about in your book that he said in his 20s and 30s. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the insight that he had. He was hopeful for the future, or he wouldn't have had his last bet, which we'll get into. And he is, the word that came up was immortal, because here you and I are talking about Benjamin Franklin. So I just love it. So he has an amazing, what you wrote about is the true story of Benjamin Franklin's will, a gift that is still making an impact 200 years later. So for the audience to know that, we're going to talk about that in the second half of this interview. Specifically, what was that gift and how is it literally impacting you and I, the listener, you and I today? So we'll get into that. So for everyone's benefit, you write in the book some of his achievements. You write, quote, Benjamin Franklin invented bifocals, the lightning rod, and a musical instrument called the glass harmonica. Mozart composed a piece for it. He proved that lightning is electricity
and coined the words electrician, battery, conductor, positive and negative charge, and electric shock. He founded Pennsylvania's first library and fire department and co-founded its first hospital and college. Wow. And all those remain, you make a point in there to say all of those remain open today. He perfected the odometer and the rocking chair. He designed a better catheter and a more efficient stove. Another connection for you and I about the stove? I write about the Benjamin Franklin stove when I wrote the first sequel to Swiss Family Robinson in 2015. Anyway, so I went back in history and found that he was part of that. He drew the first American political cartoon. I didn't know what this was, a slice up snake caption, join or die. He explained the Northern Lights and mapped the Gulf Stream. He also invented swim fins for his own prowess in the water, and he would later be inducted into the International Swimming Hall of Fame. When I think about, right, one of my books is If You Think You Can. It's all about high achievement. When I think about high achievement, it seems like after reading your book, there are few people in our history that can chalk up so many achievements, and this just scratches the surface, so many achievements in his life that have lived on as a legacy beyond his life. Any thoughts about any of that?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. Like, I remember by the time I came around to Franklin, when I was at the State Department and touching the table where he signed the Treaty of Paris, Franklin to me had just become the old guy on the $100 bill, right? He was kind of like Yoda to me. Like, oh, you'd hear these cute quotes every now and then. And maybe this is because I was staring out the window when I was an elementary and middle school student, but I don't think so. I think it's become his legacy became one of, okay, you're a founder, you were present at the Constitutional Convention, and a penny saved is a penny earned, right? He sort of became this byword for frugality and temperance and saving and so forth. Yep. And I'd forgotten, or I'd been intimidated by these large biographies, and maybe it's because there hasn't been a great movie about him. I don't know, but I'd forgotten the breadth of his achievements. You know, that this is a guy that only had 2 years of formal schooling and yet was an accomplished printer, an innovator of print technology, franchiser of print shops, inventor after he retired at 42, scientist, and then becomes a diplomat and a statesman. And then again, we'll get to, at the end of his life, a really great philanthropist, and a philanthropist that maybe one of the reasons I don't know some of these things, and your listeners might not as well, is he refused to have his name attached to his charity. He felt charity should be selfless and anonymous. And so it was the Pennsylvania Academy, which is now the University of Pennsylvania. It wasn't the Franklin University, the way George Washington University exists and so forth. Right?
You make a really good point of that in the book, and you actually compare it to other people who do put their names on everything, hoping to get a brand name out of it or something else. Right. And you make the point, he constantly deferred it. I noticed in the news that Dolly Parton declines nomination to be the first time Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee. And I thought, I don't know if it's for the same reason or not, but I love the humility, because that doesn't say that he wasn't confident. Benjamin Franklin was a confident person, but he recognized that the world probably didn't revolve around him. Would you say that is fair?
I would. And I think, you know, one of the things he writes to his mother, a letter that I use in the book that I just loved, he said, after he retired at 42, a successful printer, successful also because of the tireless work of his wife, Deborah, who I write about in the book as well. She gets short shrift a lot of the times in these biographies. Mm-hmm. But he writes to his mother, I would rather it be said that he died useful instead of he died rich. Right. And I love that when I started looking into his letters and the legacy, especially as I see it through his will, that he was one of these people that would walk out in the morning in Philadelphia and say, how can I help? Right. And I think it's a reminder to all of us, like in the best days of my parenting and being a husband, I wake up with that same attitude. I walk into a room and the first thing I say is, how can I help? Right. And you see people's faces change, like, oh, yeah, I could use some help, right? And I love this about it, because you're right. He was incredibly confident. He cared very much about how he was seen. He cared very much about his legacy. But at the same time, he felt selfless, I think, and he wanted to give back. And not only did he not put his name on his charity, he refused to have licenses for his inventions. So the patent office wasn't created until after he died, when Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. But in the 1760s, 70s, the governor of Pennsylvania would say to Franklin, you could have an exclusive commercial license for the stove, for the lightning rod. And Franklin said, no, I benefit from other people's inventions and technology. Other people should benefit freely from mine. And so he's really the founder, I think, a forerunner of the open source movement like this. Now, again, we can get into this later, but Franklin also borrowed a lot of his ideas liberally from other writers. He'd be the first to admit that a lot of those great sayings of Poor Richard dated back to the Greeks or the Old Testament, or, he was borrowing them and repurposing them. But I love the sort of cheer he has for that even, which is that we're only on this earth for a short time. Our goal is to constantly pay forward the knowledge and philanthropy of those who came before us.
I love it. Love it. Franklin lived a useful life of 84 years and 3 months. Quote, Franklin ended up living more than twice as long the average American at that time. As a barrel-chested young printer, strengthened by pushing those wheelbarrows of paper and carrying heavy trays of type, Franklin was a early fitness guru. He dabbled in vegetarianism and argued that exercise was most effective through intensity, not duration, making him an early proponent of aerobic training. As a Boston teen, this is just a cool little history right here. Yep. As a Boston teen, Franklin trained himself to survive a shipwreck by swimming miles-long circuits in the ocean with a book-filled suitcase strapped to his back. When you talk about discipline, I talk about discipline all the time. Yeah. Wow, he actually said under Poor Richard, right, as Poor Richard put it, right? You'll have to explain to the audience what Poor Richard is. But he said, diligence is the mother of good luck. What an example.
Well, there was no TV back then, right? So
True.
Later in the book, Mark Twain talks about how Franklin ruins the childhoods for young boys, right? That the parents are always yelling Franklin at them. Like, you should go out doing like Ben Franklin did. What an inspiring person. This guy really hit the ground running every day. I got the sense, it's funny, and I wonder if there's some truth to this, and that I find this with my grandmother and older people I know, that those with a positive attitude toward life and seem excited to be alive every day and to be contributing to things rather than passively accepting things from the television, seem to live longer, right? They live more productive lives that way.
That's good. That's a good reminder for all of us. Going forward on the discipline, you said he was a voluminous correspondent at a time when writing a letter meant inking a quill and scratching across fibrous paper commonly made not from wood pulp, but from old sails, hempen ropes, and rags. His surviving letters number nearly 8,000. Panning this river of words reveals the many aspects of his character and also the genesis of his parting gifts, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But I just think 8,000 hard, difficult letters that he wrote. I mean, if you were to open my phone right now, you would see in the notes section, I think the last look, because I was doing a seminar and I showed everybody, I think I have 7,600 notes of ideas and my thoughts and everything on separate notes in my iPhone, right? And I think that is easy when I can speak right into my phone, whereas he had to write it and remember it. I just think, wow, the difference from today versus then. Any thoughts around that?
This was what's funny is approaching him is again, like you look at the bookshelf and the shelves are sagging with Franklin, biographies. And I thought, I want to do something different here. A, I want to tell the story of his death, but B, in order to do that, I have to get to know who he is. And at first your heart sort of sinks of like, oh my gosh, there's 8,000 letters, right? And this is going to be black cursive ink, slanting forward.
Difficult to read. Yeah.
Yeah. And they try to cram as much as they could onto a piece of parchment. And instead I was like, this is manna from heaven. This is so much fun to read his writing because he was such a witty writer. And I think the lesson going forward for people, I think, was he learned to be a better writer by reading writers he loved. He'd read an article in a newspaper or a portion of a book. Then he would close it or put it aside. He'd try to recreate it. He tried to copy it from memory. And then he would often find in doing so, he would improve upon it. He'd inject his own verb here or his own adjective there or his own idea there. And this is seen later when Thomas Jefferson shows him the draft of the Declaration of Independence. And Franklin in the preamble says, you know what? We should hold these truths to be, and he crosses out Jefferson's word and he writes in self-evident. And I was like, this is great editing, right? He's a joy to read. And so throughout the book, you mentioned Poor Richard, in his almanac that he sold annually, this little, farmer's almanac with sunrises and sunsets and crop rotation information and so forth. He would pepper it with these sayings under the name of Poor Richard. And again, a lot of those sayings are repurposed, but throughout the book, to make Franklin come alive, I use a lot of his quotes from his letters, but also those Poor Richard sayings, because they're almost always applicable to things that are happening even 200 years later, right? That totally common wisdom passed down.
The way you did it in your book, I just thought you kept my attention.
Right.
It's a thick book. But for the audience, if you're listening to this on the podcast and not watching it on the video, just know you put in so much wisdom and richness and things that still apply today, right? Truths that don't change. And I just thought you did a great job with that. Anyway.
Thank you. I wanted it to be living history. People say it's the founding fathers. No. It's not about the 18th century at all. It's about today. This is a book about where we are as a country today.
That's right. And before we get into today, because I really want you to do that, is I just want to point this out. Benjamin Franklin, I didn't know this. I assumed it, but I didn't know this. Benjamin Franklin once owned slaves. While he was often described as a man ahead of his time, such praise elides the fact that Franklin was also a man very much of his time. That was a long time ago. As a young entrepreneur, Franklin profited from slavery, printing his weekly Pennsylvania Gazette advertisement, selling enslaved men and women or seeking those who had escaped. In 1787, 4 years after Franklin signed the Treaty of Paris, and 1 month before the start of the Constitutional Convention, the 81-year-old was elected president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery. In 1790, 2 months before he died, Benjamin Franklin submitted the first petition to Congress demanding the end of the barbarous slave trade, as well as, quote, the improvement of the conditions of the African race in the United States. His signed appeal challenged the Constitution that Franklin had helped create. Wow.
Interesting person in that he got more progressive as he aged. And maybe progressive isn't the right word. He was willing to change his mind and admit he was wrong, right? And it is true. I think it's odd because he ran away from being an indentured servant as a young man. He got away from his brother. He left Boston. That's how he ended up in Philadelphia. And you would think he would have the perspective of it's horrible to be chained, right? Or bound to something. That was just a contract, for crying out loud, let alone becoming a slave, brought to the United States or America at that time under those horrible conditions.
Right.
So he starts profiting from slavery by putting these notices in his newspaper. But at the same time, he printed the first abolitionist tract in America. There was a abolitionist, a Quaker named Benjamin Lay, who wrote a book about slaveholders were apostates. And so Franklin published that. And so with Franklin, I think it's frustrating as a biographer because you want to stand up and shout Benjamin, do you know what you're doing? One hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing. And then he and his family over the decades held in total, it's estimated between 5 and 7 slaves. He called them servants. He wouldn't use the word slaves. And he was obviously ashamed of this because he didn't write about this in his memoir or his autobiography, but it really was no secret at the time. And as the American Revolution is going on, I think you can see that creeping into him, that he knows leading abolitionists in London, including Granville Sharp. He knows leading church leaders in Philadelphia who are creating schools for, free schools for enslaved African children. He knows people who are creating schools for women and so forth. And you can see him changing in his mind that, well, this isn't compatible. How can I own a human being while at the same time decrying the fact that Americans are enslaved to a king, right? And so that change is occurring over his lifetime. He might say, I think in retrospect, that change occurred too late. And certainly he's right to be criticized for that. But he does make a point in his will in making sure that his fellow founders and future Americans know that he had made the change to abolition's side.
Totally. And you make the point. His son-in-law owed him, well, I'll just read it. Yeah. In it, Franklin directed the cancellation of a large debt owed to him by his son-in-law, calculating to the shilling at a little over 2,000 pounds, on the condition that he, quote, immediately after my decease, manument and set free his N-word man, Bob, which means basically, if I'm reading that properly, he was giving counsel that if you want me to clear this debt,
you have to release your slave.
You've got to release your slave.
Yeah. And it was the first one, the next line there, I think, it was Franklin had finally freed his first slave, but it was not a person he had owned. That his other people, his other quote unquote servants, his enslaved men and women, were allowed to sort of fade away or run away or weren't pursued over time. But Franklin had never publicly come out in the 1750s, 60s, or 70s and said, this is barbaric. I don't want to be associated with this anymore. But again, as he aged and he had made the transition to abolition's side, he made a real clear point in that will that there's one person in my family still who holds an enslaved person. And if they want to cancel this enormous debt, they first have to do this. And his son-in-law did do that.
He did. Okay, go.
That's and interestingly, his Franklin's house, Franklin Court, his son-in-law, after Franklin's death, and his son-in-law ended up living there, and it became the home to a free school for enslaved children, which was interesting.
Cool.
We're free from bondage. Yeah.
Love it. Okay, I just have a couple more because what we're doing here is painting the picture of the man. I think there's all these.
Yeah.
So I got a couple more of these. Yeah. If you can keep the freedom, quote. Yeah. At the Constitutional Convention's conclusion, Franklin has said to have stepped outside the belfried brick building known today as Independence Hall. A Philadelphian named Eliza Powell supposedly asked the 81-year-old, quote, well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy? A republic, Franklin replied, if you can keep it. And I'm thinking of the world we live in a little bit today, of how important these liberties and freedoms are. You said later in the book, 2 decades before the revolution, Franklin memorably declared, those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty or safety. Wow. Puts those comments a little bit in focus just with some of the changes in the world today, how careful we got to be to preserve some of those rights, some of those liberties, some of those freedoms. Anyway, any thoughts around that?
Well, I think, and for Franklin, that meant a free press, a press that was he obviously had his own biases, but he felt very strongly that
both sides.
Yeah, exactly. The third estate, was incredibly important to a vibrant democracy. We'll see in the book later on that his grandson becomes the first American charged under the Alien and Sedition Acts for printing things against President Washington and then President John Adams. Franklin obviously valued a free press, but even I think more importantly, and this is what we'll get into his will later on, he felt that working class people played such a crucial role in maintaining a democracy because tradespeople worked at the ground level. They saw every day the effects of government policy, the effects of taxation. They mingled with people of all different classes, races, creeds. Franklin was very much a pluralist. I talk about this in the book too. He's known for donating to many different denominations, for churches, and even the first synagogue to be built in Philadelphia. He was, he believed so strongly in sort of the public marketplace and the public exchange of ideas. And I think today, if he were back, that would be something that would really shock him. I think if he'd see, I don't think the partisanship would shock him because that was certainly of his time. He didn't get along with a lot of his founders, the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, because you're right. Because in the subtitle, very divisive. Yeah.
I mean, his first American, he never had a state funeral, which blew my mind. That he
blew my mind. Yeah.
And that his first American eulogy wasn't read till nearly a year after his death. And it was read by his biggest enemy, a man that had slandered Franklin for having his son out of wedlock, maybe with a prostitute. So, I think the takeaway for me when I was reading that, when he said like a republic, if you can keep it, I love that story. Gosh, I hope that's true. And that's from Eliza Powell's diary, which you can read at the Library of Congress and online at their websites. But his notion of what that republic meant was messy. But at the same time, it was that working class people have a role to play and we have to support them and we have to listen to their voices. Otherwise, we will fall back into rule by gentry, which to him would be the same as being ruled by a king again.
Well, and what you're saying resonates with me as I do consulting inside companies. I'm telling leaders all the time, you've got to listen to your people. They're the ones closest to the action. And if they don't feel that they're being heard, let alone some of their greatest ideas that can solve some of your biggest problems are going to come from those frontline workers. And if you're not listening to them, and I think if Benjamin Franklin was alive today, he would really be an example of what it means to show good leadership and listen to your people and value all their efforts instead of picking and choosing, if you will. Anyway,
I think he'd walk into those focus meetings and he'd say, "How can I help?" I really do.
You said that in the beginning, and Peter Drucker, who wrote the effective executive book back in the 60s or so, he said one of the 8 patterns of successful leaders was the desire to contribute. And as I was reading your book, that kept going through my mind. Benjamin Franklin was constantly finding ways to help. How can I help? How can I help? Anyway.
Right.
Okay, just a couple more. You already mentioned political salary, so we won't read that, but at a time when just in the U.S. news, we have House staff budgets for salaries went up 21% compared to last year's. Anyway, I just think it's amazing. Benjamin Franklin did not believe, this is what you said, at the Constitutional Convention a year before, Franklin had argued that elected officials should not be paid. Different world.
Or only the greedy and avaricious would seek office to promote themselves, he said. Again, his fellow delegates were like, "Okay, Ben, sure," right? They kind of nodded and let him talk, but didn't take it seriously. But
they didn't take it seriously, no.
He refused to be paid when he was president of Pennsylvania, the governor of Pennsylvania. He served 3 one-year terms, and he refused to be paid a salary. And that salary is what he used to stake his last bet and these small loans for trade workers.
We're going to go right there. So the last 2 things I wanted to share was faith in God. In a month preceding his death, a minister asked Franklin about his faith. It was the first time I had been questioned upon it, Franklin replied. You write in there, unbelievably. Right. Here is my creed, he says. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, and he ought to be worshiped. That the most acceptable service we can render to him is in doing good to his other children. That the soul of man is immortal, and that we will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be fundamental principles of all sound religion, Benjamin Franklin says, as I regard them as you do, in whatever sect I meet them. I just think, wow, okay, that's great. It's good to know, right? He believed in a higher power. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Pain and pleasure. I just think this is good because it comes down to personal power. I always say personal power starts with personal restraint. And this is what, I didn't know this, but this is what Benjamin Franklin said. That year's almanac saw Poor Richard's caution, quote, "Many a man thinks he is buying pleasure when he is really selling himself a slave to it." I think that's true today. I think we have to be careful what we engage in or divulge in and what we fill our mind with and so forth. You can become conditioned and programmed, and then it will control your life. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think he was speaking both of, stay out of debt, but also don't, in regards to that, it was, don't waste your money on stuff you don't need, right? And then the thing you just said too is he's almost presaging the dangers of social media and the 24-hour news cycle. You really can get yourself in a hole if you start your day with pain and misery, right? As opposed to reading something positive.
Just huge. Okay, last one. And then we're going to get into the bet.
Okay.
Rich and poor. Franklin was born as the poorest among us, one printer pronounced, but he had the courage not to be ashamed by poverty. The line recalled Poor Richard's maxim, quote, "Having been poor is no shame, but being ashamed of it is."
Yeah.
A mindset. I think that's that's an abundance mindset. You could be living in a dark place, but if you do everything you can in your power not to live there and accept that as your future reality, it just seemed as I was reading the book, I mean, here he was achieving, if not more, he was making a huge impact after the time he retired at 42. He was still achieving after 42 all the way up to 80. Did I say 84 earlier? He died at 84? Yeah.
Yeah, and always felt uneducated and not smart enough, which always cracks me up when I read his letters. He's constantly referring to, I'm probably not the one to say this, or what do I know? And it's like, oh, come on, Ben, get over yourself, But I think a lot of us feel that way, right? I mean, when you're a writer, it doesn't matter what you've written before. You're still staring at that blank screen or your blank piece of paper, starting all over again. And so many people listening, I'm sure, feel that imposter syndrome sense, right? Like, I don't deserve the success I have, or I didn't earn this somehow, or they're going to find me out. I still feel that way with Franklin. I'm waiting for someone to tell me, like, you're not qualified to write about Benjamin Franklin.
My mom told me the first time I was writing my first book, and she didn't mean it in a negative way. I love her. She's a saint. It's all good. But she said, who are you to write a book? This is many years ago, right? And it's not a negative thing. It's just sometimes other people can't see it. But I've gone past that imposter syndrome. I'm good today. But I tell you, early on, it took a little bit of a belief that I really was that person. And that doesn't mean I know everything, because I don't. Anyway, that's why I have people like you on the show. Anyway. Okay, let's talk about, please explain to the audience The Last Bet. And I noticed the term throughout, when you talked about it all throughout, is the loan scheme. So give us kind of the idea here.
Sure. So Franklin, he was wealthy when he died, and he made sure to in the beginning of his will, to give gifts to his heirs, his son and daughter, and his two grandchildren, gifts that came with lessons attached or morals, like to his son-in-law, that you can cancel this debt, but you have to free the enslaved man that you hold.
Correct.
And then 10 months before he dies, Franklin remembers this idea that a French writer had sent to him a decade before, saying that, you could take some money, put it aside, let compound interest, accrue value on that. But in the meantime, you could help young workers by loaning it to them in small bits. And so Franklin is really sort of the forerunner of microfinance here. And that 10 months before he dies, he says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I remember this idea from this French guy. I'm going to leave £1,000, which was a lot of money back then. The dollar had not been official currency until 1792. So this is 1789 we're talking about. I'm going to leave £1,000 to Boston, where I was born, Philadelphia, where I made my fortune. You're going to have people in the community come forward, manage this money for free. You're going to loan a bit of it, 60-pound increments, a couple $100, to young married tradesmen who want to start their own businesses. And then they're going to pay it back at a small interest rate over 10 years. The principal will accrue, and then you're going to keep loaning it to more and more tradesmen. And then after 100 years from my death, I want Boston and Philadelphia to take a portion of that principal and agree to build something to benefit the common good. But I'm not done. I want you to take the remainder of the money and loan it to tradespeople to open their own businesses for another 100 years. And then on the bicentennial of my death, I want Boston and Philadelphia to get together and, again, use the money, which by that point he calculated would be a windfall, an enormous jackpot of money, millions and millions of pounds and dollars, and build something for the common good. And so he's basically ensuring that he's going to remain in American headlines or American thoughts for 200 years. all the while supporting small businesses be started by entrepreneurial tradesmen.
Unbelievable. And through the whole book, let me just show the cover of the book again. Through the whole book, you talk about how it is using his own words, you could tell that Benjamin Franklin truly valued tradesmen and skillful workers. And in fact, you say, I would have the managers of the donation, frankly directed, then lay out at their discretion 100,000 pounds in public works, which may be judged of most general utility to its inhabitants, such as fortifications, bridges, aqueducts, public buildings, baths, pavements, and whatever make living in the town more convenient for its people and render it more agreeable to strangers. You see this pattern all throughout everything you were writing about. This last will that he had was all forward thinking, making America. My natural instinct was to say, make America great again. But it was really about making America great. Because like you said, in the beginning, it was confusing. It was kind of jumbled a little bit. Yeah. And here he had a vision for that, in a sense.
And I also think, it speaks a lot to what government was like when he died, that he's thinking, okay, 100 years from now, you might need a bridge. You might need to pave the streets. There was no income tax when Franklin died. You just had a nominal property tax. Right. And so it's funny, I think, he's looking ahead like, hey, with my experience in Philadelphia, sometimes you need a new wharf. Sometimes you need clean water. So I want my money to go to that. In fact, Boston and Philadelphia, I think, were much more inventive what they ended up doing with this money. Mm-hmm. But it really does. To go back to this loan scheme, today, philanthropists and donations, it's sort of a self-branding exercise. Often the name's attached to the gift. It goes on a building or something like that. Franklin is doing this. His name's not attached to this gift. He thinks people are going to come forward, manage it for free out of the goodness of their heart to help the rising generation. He wrote in his will that good apprentices make good citizens. Yeah. I want those people involved in our democracy. And again, he's really hoping to just pay forward the support that he got when he was starting his print shop as a young person. So
would he donate the money to a business, or would he say, here's a person, I've gone through maybe their application, let's just keep it simple,
that's right.
Right, their application, and we think this is someone worthy of receiving the funds that will honor it. And then as that person became successful, they would pay it back with a little bit of interest. Is that how it would work?
Yep, that's exactly right. So the first, if you look at the first 10 recipients in Boston and Philadelphia, it was a bricklayer, a tailor, a carpenter, a saddler, a baker. You can sort of see a village forming. It was fun when I opened the ledgers and looked at the loans. It was like, there's one of each of you. I can see the main street, and hear the tinking of the anvil and sort of the hammer on the anvil. And then as they were successful, exactly, after they hung their shingle out with their own bosses, they would pay this back at 5% interest, and it would help the principal accrue. And it's interesting, Franklin was so confident in his own example. He's like, well, if you just work hard, you're going to be fine, And he did not foresee the Industrial Revolution. He did not foresee that machines would start doing some of the work of tradespeople. He did not foresee another war, the War of 1812, that caused the financial panic and really dented Philadelphia's economy, especially. He did not see things like the opening of the Erie Canal, which drew a lot of trade away from Philadelphia's port. He did not think there'd be a new capital called Washington, D.C. that would take away Philadelphia's, center as the financial capital. He did not understand that in Boston, the old interests of the universities and the parishes would produce families that would hold office into the 5th generation, the 6th generation, and that their wealth would necessitate the invention of something called the investment bank and the professional trustee and the mutual fund, right? And he had no idea that there was going to be a financial revolution in America that said, you know what, the best thing you can do with money is let it grow. Put it somewhere safe. Don't lend it out to unreliable bricklayers. Instead, our job is to protect it. So 100 years from now, those Bostonians can use it to build a bridge or a bathhouse or whatever. And so I love in the book, one thing that's fun about writing it, and also frankly reading it, is that Franklin wasn't always right. And there's a lot of turns that his money takes that wasn't necessarily nefarious or bad ideas, but he didn't leave a lot of instructions for people, right? And so as America's economy changes, so changes his gift and how it's managed. And so also changes the definition of what a skilled tradesperson is, right? Like in his time, it was a bricklayer. In our time, that could be a computer coder or someone who fixes HVAC systems, you know? And I love, though, that enough people were involved, and I loved his idea for this loan, that they were willing to step forward and rescue the money when it was in danger of, you know, being eliminated. Like Andrew Carnegie steps forward at one point and says, I'll match Benjamin Franklin. Mm-hmm. And I also love that there are people to this day that have stepped forward and said, no, this is still really a good idea. And although we're not helping carpenters necessarily, we can still help the younger generation of tradespeople today.
Love it. Yeah. Wow. That's how it relates to today. Wasn't there, did I read somewhere in there was a time when the Franklin family came in and said, listen, we're going to take this trust from you guys. You guys aren't being responsible, kind of a thing. And then it went back.
All of a sudden, after the centennial of his death, 1890, there's all these Franklin heirs and descendants that step forward, and they're really famous people. Like, it shouldn't be surprising to me, but I guess it was, that you have the first dean of Radcliffe College, and you have the first surveyor for the Naval Academy who's building lighthouses during the Civil War and so forth. These people all come forward and say, Philadelphia, you especially are not managing this the way our grandfather or great grandfather wanted you to do. So the money should come to us, and you better do something about it. Yeah. And so, you know, I say in the book, it's a very American story. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America, he said, America is really a law-abiding society. And by law, he meant the Constitution is a contract, right? And that the Declaration of Independence is really a grievance, a writ. And that Franklin's descendants did what a lot of Americans do, which is they decided to sue. And there's a part in the book where I don't want to bog the reader down in the courts, but they do use the courts to get the money back on track and to put it back towards what Franklin wanted it used for.
And it's still active today, right? This is still amazing. Yeah. Wow.
I want listeners to know that this isn't dusty old history. This is contemporary American history. Yeah.
Exactly.
Historic street residence for today. Yeah.
Which, by the way, if I'm reading it correctly, the money he gave to Boston, 1,000 pounds.
Yep.
And Philadelphia, 1,000 pounds. The gross domestic product at the time for 2000 was $8,888,000 and $8,888.88. He left to Boston, Philadelphia, would equal today approximately $1 billion. Yeah.
I know this is what's so hard about historic money. I have to say, and I hedged my bet in the final copy of the book, where I was like, that sounds like a lot, but listeners should know it's really difficult to calculate historical money, because what I ended up doing instead was talk about like what a pound would have bought you then. A pound, you know, even into the 1850s would have been a week's salary for a laborer. The head of the Bank of England in 1850 only made 400 pounds a year. Now, today, the CEO of the Bank of England makes tens of millions of pounds a year, right? And so I do say to the readers in the beginning that we're using these numbers. The important thing is it wasn't a small amount of money. Franklin, you know, died wealthy, as I said, but in his house, he had less than 2 pounds in coins. His most valuable possession was his printing press, which was worth a couple £100. You know, you could have a whole business around that. So 1,000 pounds each. And it was large enough that in his will, he precedes the donation with a paragraph to his heirs saying, I'm really sorry you're not getting this money, but my father gave me nothing. And so you shouldn't expect anything from your forefather either. This is going to be put to better use.
Love it. Okay. I love this. His philanthropy beginnings. Where did it come from? You write about. But who inspired Benjamin Franklin's charity, despite or because of his lack of schooling? Because, by the way, he never finished college, but he got some honorary
2 years of primary school. Yep.
2 years of primary school and then some honorary degrees later on.
Right.
Franklin found his first role models. I love this. Found his first role models on the shelf. Quote, a little money that came into my hands, he wrote, of this Boston childhood was ever laid out in books. His favorite, were laid out in books. And I remember Charlie Tremendous Jones, who impacted my world many years ago. He since died. What a great man and influence he was on my life, but he would always say, you will be the same person in 5 years as you are today, except for the people you meet and the books you read. And I just want to put an emphasis on reading books and becoming learned. And if you don't have a sphere of influence around you that's pushing you to be better than what you are today, you can find many of those examples and stories that will inspire you inside the books of biographies and so forth. Any thoughts around the power of that?
Yeah, I was surprised. It was fun to look back at the inventory taken of his house after he died to see what books were on the shelf. He loved Robinson Crusoe, which sort of makes sense to me looking back on it, because Robinson Crusoe is a young man who's told by his father, you'll inherit nothing from me. Yeah. And so he goes and sets off at sea, ends up shipwrecked, ends up becoming wealthy in the end. And Franklin always thought he was going to be shipwrecked, when he was training in the harbor. But he read the Puritan minister Cotton Mather, Essays on Doing Good. And Franklin's first pen name was Silence Do-Good, and he took that do-good right from Cotton Mather's, the title of his sermon and his book. And Franklin was so influenced by the ideas of Defoe and Mather, and these ideas of everything from you should have community groups that meet weekly to talk about problems that need solving in your neighborhood, which Cotton Mather did with each parish. They had one of these gatherings in Boston. To Daniel Defoe wrote, before Robinson Crusoe, wrote about the need for a pension system for widows of sailors that went into the deep. He talked about the need for a firefighting brigade. He talked about the need for education for women. He talked about the need for tax-deductible charitable organizations or deductions from property taxes and so forth. And I love that Franklin was never afraid to say, you know what, that other person's got a really good idea. I'm going to use that. And I'm not going to claim, I'll claim it as my own with my improvements, but he wasn't one of these people that shut his ears to getting advice from people who were smarter or more experienced than he was.
I love that. Let me just say for the audience, get a copy of this book, Ben Franklin's Last Bet. You go into detail. It's rich. You go into detail of how it applies today. And maybe there's some principles. I think what I was really feeling as I was reading it is there's principles in here in this last well that truly can be a blueprint for some of the policies that are put forward today. Love it. So in the book, talking about brains in college, I thought this was pretty insightful that you wrote about. She and my stepfather, so I'm assuming you're talking about your family background, count themselves among the nearly 2/3 of Americans without a 4-year college degree. Their skills and applied intelligence surpassed those of most of the students and colleagues at the universities where I have spent much of my adult life, you say. Yeah. I've yet to meet an English major who can calculate payroll, decode ever-changing tax laws and healthcare plans, read blueprints, estimate a job's cost, and precisely cut and weld, deliver and install at a building site an essential item that most people only ever notice when it needs repair. Wow. Politicians and pundits rightfully raise their voices against sexism and racism, but they often remain silent on credentialism, perhaps the last accepted prejudice, discounting those without degrees.
Yeah. And I say that as an English professor.
Yeah.
I often look at my students and say, you should learn how to hang windows. You can get $200 a window and set your own schedule, and you can you can do your writing on the side. And I don't want to start a class war here, and I'm not denigrating my career as a professor
not at all.
As a writer, but we have become so focused on college prep. What college are you going to? What college to get into? Not only do you have a major anymore, you have a minor, and then you have 17 certificates you're adding on to your degree and so forth. And it's exhausting for my students. And I see them, laboring under debt and anxiety about their future job prospects and the enormous course loads they take on. And I think, boy, Franklin would look at this and say, what are you doing to yourselves? We have, there was Harvard in Franklin's time. He didn't go to it. He frowned upon it, but he didn't say we shouldn't have a Harvard. You can still have a Harvard. We can have our 4-year degree programs, but there's another way of living. And most Americans do make their livings with their hands or working in the service sector without, a professional credential behind them.
And I think there's power to say, just to tag on to what you've said.
Yeah.
Maybe for you, it's not the typical what you think of as a university. Maybe it's going to a trade school, or maybe it's just working and doing something where you do just use your hands and you become so proficient, you are able to develop and succeed at creating a successful life. So I just think that was just a good reminder there that maybe I expect my kids to finish their college degrees and so forth, granted. But I also want them to learn how to live life. And some of that's not taught in the university walls. So anyway.
Yeah. And I think, the other thing too that Franklin would say, just to piggyback on top of that, is I think he'd be really surprised right now at the quote unquote new economy, right? And these terms that we throw around now, like freelance and zero contract labor. And, I got a gig, and it all sounds so freeing. It's like, oh my gosh, you must have a great life and so much time on your hands. But these jobs don't come with benefits or stability. And so, I think the thing that Franklin, again, his whole point of supporting tradespeople and wanting people to start their own businesses is that you can control your own destiny in that regard. And if you can produce your own, if you can control your labor and your hours and your business and the work you take on, you're probably going to have a stable and more happier life.
Wow. I love that, especially coming from a professor.
Yeah, listen to the English professor.
The English professor saying, you're describing my world right now. I told my kids when they were in high school, you can either go get a job or you can learn how to work with customers, how to figure out your expenses, your costs and your profits, how to pay taxes and so forth. They went and started a simple window cleaning company. And up here in Washington, in a place called Bainbridge Island, they got so many calls to wash the windows of these $1 million homes that are up here, just beautiful homes that would make, in a matter of 2.5 days, they would hire their friends. They'd go up there and they would make $1,600. And what they learned from that is, as a young person, how to be responsible, how to understand that, hey, the sky's the limit if I'm willing to go out and, bust a move and work really hard and be creative. And what do you mean? There's a style to speak to people and to connect with people. I mean, there's some good stuff in that. So anyway, I just think the book, how would you say in the end, by and large, from Benjamin Franklin's time to where we're at today, how would you think if Benjamin Franklin were to come to life, how would you think he would look at today's world?
I don't think he'd be surprised by the partisanship of our political system. That was alive during his time. I don't think he'd be surprised to see Boston and Philadelphia still thriving. I love it. At the end of the book, I land at Philadelphia's wharf and I make the walk up Market Street, just like Franklin did. And he'd see the steeple on Christ Church that he raised the money for to have constructed. And he'd recognize the same layout of the street. And in Boston, he'd still see Harvard across the Charles River. And he'd see, the site of where he was born. He'd see his parents' grave at the Granary Burying Ground by the Common. I think he'd be really happy at how much actually hasn't changed from his time. But I think he'd be very sad, again, at the fact that working class people don't really have a voice in our political system anymore. And over half of Americans identify as working class. In the last survey, less than 2% of Congress people had ever held a working class job. And this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of the podcast, in this interview, that if you have that disconnect between people making policies and the people who have to live with those policies, that's where we get into trouble. And that's where we get people buying out of the political system, not believing it anymore, not wanting to participate, or choosing candidates that give them a voice that they feel they can participate. That might always not be in their best interests, right? On either side of the aisle. I'm not even being a partisan here.
No, it's not about being partisan, but it is difficult if it's very divisive, and you say, well, I'm going to go run for office and make a difference, but maybe my family would be dragged through the mud on this. Maybe I won't. Maybe I won't do it now.
And I think it too. It goes again. The voices we hear all day. If you do find yourself flipping through TV news channels or looking at the internet, the people who appear on our screens usually have a title next to their name, right? They have a credential. They're a doctor. They're what such and such. What university they work at. What think tank they work at. And I think, again, Frank would look at that and say, well, why don't we have normal people on television? Why don't we hear what they think and what it's like right now to train to repair HVAC systems? And again, I think most listeners know this. You don't value tradespeople until you need one, and then it's really hard sometimes to be like, oh, it's really hard to find someone to wash my windows, right? Why is that? And that's a whole separate conversation. But
Frank, you're onto it. We're on the same page. Yeah.
Would be dismayed by that.
I think I've said it already several times, but you did a really good job with this book. I enjoyed reading it. I felt like I learned a lot. I felt like I gained wisdom by through your research, and it really pointed back to that leadership principle that I've been trying to teach all these years. Leaders need to listen, and politicians need to listen to the frontline workers. There's so much value there that I think it's unnoticed and could help our country, our communities, our families, our work become more effective. All right. How can people get the book? Where should I point them? Where can I put a link? What's the best way?
Wherever fine books are sold, support your local bookstore. If you can't get to a local bookstore, it's available online everywhere. You can check in with me on Twitter. I'm at Meyer Writer, MEYER WRITER, Meyer Writer on Twitter. Every day I put up a picture from something I see here in Taipei or Taiwan. So even if you don't want to hear about Benjamin Franklin and you're just curious what daily life looks like in Taiwan, check my Twitter feed and you can communicate with me there as well.
很好啊，
很好啊，不错。
不错。This is 很好的. This is a very good interview. 我很想我要去台湾。
欢迎你。
Anyway, sorry for the listeners. Just have a little bit of fun in Chinese. Anyway, just saying I would love to go to Taiwan right now and so forth.
I said welcome.
Yeah, no, totally. So anyway, it was great to have you on the show. And I really appreciate the work that you've done. And all the accomplished. I was looking over your bio and just you've done some amazing things, and keep being that voice for good out there would really be great. So thank you for being on the show.
It was a delight. Thanks for having me.
You bet.